The Retro Football League presents The Extra Point. Powered by Wolverine Studios Draft Day Sports Pro Football. It's time to take the field. What are you bringing to the table? And now, for our host, Lance McAllister.
Welcome back, football fans, to another exciting episode of The Extra Point. I'm your host, Lance McAllister, bringing you all the latest news, highlights, and analysis from the Retro Football League, where old school meets gridiron glory. Week 3 has just wrapped up, and we've got a lot to unpack. So get ready to dive into the world of gritty, hard-hitting football as we break down all the action and get you up to speed on everything RFL. Let's get started, shall we? In a dominating performance, the Atlanta Falcons crushed the Denver Broncos with a score of 63-0. The Falcons' offense was firing on all cylinders, led by quarterback Ron Jaworski, who went 19 for 22 with 186 passing yards and 4 touchdowns. Running back Bob Farrell had a standout performance as well, with 137 rushing yards on 11 carries, averaging an impressive 12.5 yards per carry and scoring a touchdown. The Falcons' defense was equally impressive, holding the Broncos scoreless and limiting them to just 102 total yards of offense. Linebacker Keith Butler was named the Defensive Player of the Game, recording 2 tackles for loss and an interception. Player of the Game honors went to Bob Farrell, who had a phenomenal game on the ground. Farrell rushed for 137 yards and averaged 12.5 yards per carry, finding the end zone once. His performance was a key factor in the Falcons' offensive dominance. On the defensive side of the ball, linebacker Keith Butler stood out with 2 tackles for loss and an interception. Butler's disruptive play helped shut down the Broncos' offense and secure the shutout victory for the Falcons. The Cincinnati Bengals faced off against the New England Patriots in a low-scoring game. The Patriots took an early lead in the first quarter with a touchdown, while the Bengals failed to put points on the board. The Bengals' defense stepped up in the third quarter, holding the Patriots to only a field goal, while finally getting a field goal of their own to narrow the lead. In the end, the Patriots held on to their lead, winning the game 10-6. The offensive player of the game was Andy Johnson from the Patriots, who rushed for 99 yards and scored a touchdown. The defensive player of the game was Coy Bacon from the Bengals, who made 2 tackles, 1 sack, and forced 1 fumble. The Cleveland Browns defeated the Baltimore Colts in a 24-13 victory. The Browns showcased a strong rushing attack led by running back Greg Pruitt, who had an outstanding performance with 32 rushes for 235 yards and an average of 7.3 yards per carry. Pruitt also found the end zone twice, contributing to the Browns' offensive success. On the defensive end, linebacker John Zamberlan stood out for the Browns, leading the team in tackles with 9 and making 2 tackles for loss. Their defensive effort helped limit the Colts' offense, holding them to just 13 points. Overall, the Browns displayed a balanced performance and were able to secure the win over the Colts. The New York Jets hosted the Detroit Lions in a game that saw the Jets come out on top with a final score of 17-7. The Jets started with a 3-point lead in the first quarter and maintained their dominance throughout the game. Haskell Stanback showcased an impressive performance, rushing for 120 yards on 15 attempts with an average of 8 yards per carry and scoring a touchdown. Phil Simms led the Jets' passing game with 71 yards, completing 10 out of 17 attempts. The Jets' defense was led by Gary Spanny with 11 tackles, including 6 tackles for loss. The standout player of the game was running back Haskell Stanback, who was named the Offensive Player of the Game for his exceptional rushing performance. On the other hand, the Detroit Lions struggled to find momentum and could only manage to score 7 points. Greg Landry led the Lions' passing game with 121 yards, completing 13 out of 23 attempts. Dexter Bussey had a strong game rushing for 134 yards on 22 attempts, with an average of 6.1 yards per carry and scoring a touchdown. Defensively, Charlie Weaver stood out for the Lions with 8 tackles, including 4 tackles for loss. However, their efforts were not enough to overcome the Jets' strong performance. The defensive player of the game was awarded to cornerback Virgil Livers for his 7 tackles and an interception. The Philadelphia Eagles dominated the New Orleans Saints in a 24-3 victory. Joe Ferguson led the Eagles' offense, completing 22 out of 26 passes for 290 yards and 2 touchdowns. Gary Davis was the leading rusher for Philadelphia with 76 yards on 16 carries, while also contributing with a reception for 4 yards. Fred Biletnikoff stood out with 7 catches for 121 yards and a touchdown, earning him the Offensive Player of the Game honors. On the defensive side, Frank Lemaster was a force for the Eagles, recording 7 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, and 2 sacks. Philadelphia's strong performance secured them the win and boosted their overall record. The New Orleans Saints struggled to generate offense in the game, finishing with only 159 total yards. Archie Manning had a tough outing, completing 11 out of 19 passes for just 82 yards. Chuck Muncie was the leading rusher for the Saints, but managed only 38 yards on 13 carries. Clarence Chapman stood out on defense with 8 tackles for New Orleans. However, their efforts were not enough to stop the Eagles' potent offense. The loss dropped the Saints' record and highlighted their need to regroup moving forward. The Green Bay Packers dominated the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in a rainy and windy game, coming away with a 27-0 victory. The Packers got off to a quick start, scoring a touchdown in the first quarter to take a 7-0 lead. However, the scoring slowed down in the second quarter with both teams failing to put any points on the board. In the third quarter, the Packers extended their lead with another touchdown, making it 14-0. They sealed the victory in the fourth quarter, scoring 2 more touchdowns to complete the shutout. Packers running back Mike Strawn was the offensive standout of the game, rushing for 69 yards and 1 touchdown. John Anderson led the Packers' defense with 9 tackles, including 2 tackles for loss and 1 sack. Despite a solid defensive effort, especially from linebacker Bob Brudzinski who had 12 tackles and 6 tackles for loss, the Buccaneers couldn't find any success on offense. Quarterback Danny White struggled, completing just 12 out of 26 passes for 89 yards. Running back Charlie Davis had a decent game, rushing for 78 yards with an average of 4.1 yards per carry, but it wasn't enough to generate any points for the Buccaneers. This loss puts the Buccaneers in a tough spot as they look to bounce back in the next game. The Houston Oilers dominated the Kansas City Chiefs in a one-sided game. The Oilers, led by quarterback Dan Pastorini, threw for 266 yards and 2 touchdowns. Running back Don Hardman had an exceptional game, rushing for 86 yards with 4 touchdowns and adding 29 receiving yards to his impressive performance. Defensively, Willie Lanier stood out with 15 tackles, including 3 tackles for loss. The Chiefs, on the other hand, struggled to find rhythm on offense. Quarterback Ken Anderson threw for just 130 yards, and running back Archie Griffin could only muster 49 yards rushing. Ken Riley led the Chiefs' defense with 7 tackles. Ultimately, Don Hardman's outstanding performance earned him the Offensive Player of the Game, while Gary Barbaro's impressive defensive stats including 6 tackles, 1 interception, and 1 forced fumble earned him the Defensive Player of the Game title. The Minnesota Vikings hosted the Miami Dolphins in a high-scoring game. The Dolphins took an early lead with a field goal in the first quarter, but the Vikings responded with 2 touchdowns in the second quarter to take a 14-3 lead. The Dolphins fought back in the second quarter, scoring 2 touchdowns of their own to regain the lead at halftime, 17-14. In the second half, both teams continued to trade touchdowns. The Vikings regained the lead briefly in the third quarter, but the Dolphins scored 15 unanswered points in the fourth quarter to secure a 32-28 victory. Benny Malone had a standout performance for the Dolphins, rushing for 185 yards and 2 touchdowns. Despite the loss, Fran Tarkenton had an impressive game for the Vikings, throwing for 184 yards and 2 touchdowns while also rushing for 167 yards and 1 touchdown. The San Diego Chargers faced off against the Buffalo Bills in a close-fought game. The Chargers started strong, with a touchdown in the first quarter, but the Bills quickly caught up and maintained a close score throughout the game. In the end, the Bills were able to secure a victory in overtime, winning with a final score of 29-23. Glenn Carano led the Bills' offense with an impressive passing performance, completing 18 out of 30 passes for 292 yards and 2 touchdowns. Tony Nathan also contributed with 27 rushing attempts for 83 yards. On defense, Mark Gastineau stood out with 8 tackles and 1 sack. Overall, it was a thrilling game that came down to the wire, and the Bills emerged victorious in the end. The Dallas Cowboys dominated the Chicago Bears in a 34-7 victory. The Cowboys started off strong with a field goal in the first quarter and followed it up with a touchdown in the second quarter, giving them a 10-0 lead at halftime. They continued to pour on the points in the third quarter, scoring 2 more touchdowns to extend their lead to 24-0. The Bears finally got on the board in the third quarter with a touchdown, but it was too little, too late. The Cowboys' offense was led by quarterback Warren Moon, who threw for 248 yards and 3 touchdowns. Running back Tony Dorsett also had a strong performance, rushing for 88 yards and a touchdown, while adding 55 receiving yards and 2 more touchdowns. Defensively, the Cowboys were led by Bob Brunig, who had 12 tackles and 4 tackles for loss. Defensive end Randy White also made an impact with 7 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, and a sack. It was a complete team effort for the Cowboys, as they outgained the Bears in total yards, 337 to 209, and controlled the time of possession. Overall, it was a dominant performance by the Cowboys and a night to forget for the Bears. The Pittsburgh Steelers dominated the St. Louis Cardinals in a 26-7 victory. The Steelers' offense was led by quarterback Terry Bradshaw, who completed 11 of 12 passes for 160 yards and a touchdown. Running back Bo Matthews had an outstanding game, rushing for 127 yards and a touchdown on 24 carries. He was named the Offensive Player of the game. The Steelers' defense was also impressive, with Lauren Taves leading the team with 8 tackles and 2 tackles for loss. Overall, it was a strong performance by the Steelers on both sides of the ball, securing them the win. In contrast, the St. Louis Cardinals struggled to get their offense going and only managed to score 1 touchdown. Quarterback Joe Montana had a modest game, completing 15 of 26 passes for 115 yards and a touchdown. Running back Walter Payton was held to just 63 yards on 23 carries. The Cardinals' defense had a tough time containing the Steelers' offense, allowing 399 total yards. It was a disappointing performance for the Cardinals, who couldn't find a way to stop the Steelers from running away with the game. In a game filled with defensive dominance, the Seattle Seahawks fell to the Oakland Raiders with a final score of 10-28. The Seahawks struggled to move the ball effectively, recording only 286 total yards compared to the Raiders' 237. Seattle's quarterback, Jim Zorn, completed just 6 out of 17 passes for 127 yards and 1 touchdown. Their rushing attack was led by Sherman Smith, who ran for 142 yards on 17 carries, averaging an impressive 8.4 yards per carry. However, it wasn't enough to overcome the strong defensive effort by the Raiders. On the other side, the Oakland Raiders quarterback Ken Stabler completed 15 out of 24 passes for 96 yards and 1 touchdown. The team's rushing attack was led by Robert Miller, who rushed for 90 yards on 21 carries, averaging 4.3 yards per carry. Defensively, the Raiders were dominant, with linebacker Brian Kelly leading the way with 8 tackles, a sack, an interception, and a forced fumble. In a game marked by strong defensive performances, it was the Raiders who came out on top with a comfortable victory over the Seahawks. The Los Angeles Rams hosted the San Francisco 49ers in a game that saw the Rams come out on top with a score of 17-7. The game was played in challenging weather conditions, with a temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit, a 12 miles per hour wind, and rain. The Rams' offense was led by quarterback Mike Barilla, who completed 7 out of 11 passes for 97 yards. However, it was running back Earl Campbell who stood out as the offensive player of the game. Campbell had an outstanding performance, rushing 25 times for 127 yards and an average of 5.1 yards per carry. He also scored a crucial touchdown that helped secure the victory for the Rams. On the defensive side, linebacker Isaiah Robertson led the team with 12 tackles and made 2 tackles for loss. However, it was not all positive for the Rams, as they committed 3 penalties for a total of 35 yards. Despite the rainy weather, the 49ers' offense struggled to generate points. Quarterback Roger Staubach completed 18 out of 27 passes for 145 yards but was unable to find the end zone. Running back Otis Anderson was the leading rusher for the 49ers, with 67 yards on 19 carries and scoring their only touchdown of the game. Linebacker Greg Brezina was a standout for the 49ers' defense with 15 tackles, including 3 tackles for a loss. Overall, the Rams' strong performance on both sides of the ball led them to a well-deserved victory. In a battle between NFC East rivals, the Washington Redskins hosted the New York Giants in a game that ended in a decisive 24-3 victory for the home team. The Redskins dominated throughout, scoring 9 points in the second quarter and adding 3 points in each of the third and fourth quarters. Quarterback Joe Theismann led the offense, completing 12 out of 20 passes for 129 yards. Running back Calvin Hill had a solid performance, rushing for 79 yards on 28 carries. Kicker Rick Danmeyer was named the offensive player of the game, contributing to the victory with successful field goals and extra points. On the defensive side, Carl Lorch stood out with 5 tackles and 4 tackles for a loss. The Giants struggled to find their rhythm, with Gifford Nielsen completing only 11 out of 25 passes for 116 yards. Running back Lydell Mitchell managed just 19 yards on 10 carries. Ted Hendricks led the Giants' defense with 11 tackles and 3 tackles for a loss. And that's a wrap for this week's episode of The Extra Point. We've recapped all the thrilling action from Week 3 of the Retro Football League. Make sure to tune in next week as we bring you more game updates, analysis, and interviews with some of the league's biggest stars. Until then, I'm Lance McAllister signing off, reminding you to keep chasing those touchdowns and never miss the extra point.